Hello, and thanks for joining us on Caravan to Midnight. You know, every once in a while we do a theme week. In fact, frequently we do theme weeks. We'll do an Intel week or a health week or something. We're doing a music week for this particular week. And even though I know it was February the 9th when the Beatles invaded America officially, although I find out after all these years I knew I didn't have it wrong. I knew I was not hallucinating, particularly at that age. But I had seen the Beatles, in fact, on the Jack Parr show. I thought it was Sullivan, but I thought it was during the week. Oh well, it's kind of hard to remember 50 years ago, but I came close. So that means the synapses are still firing. Yeah, the Beatles actually were shown on American TV on the Jack Parr show in '63 before they actually made their debut in February of '64. And on this episode of Caravan to Midnight, we are privileged to talk with Elliot Mintz. Elliot Mintz fell in love with radio and television. He's a New Yorker who went immediately to the West Coast, went immediately to Los Angeles, and became a radio talk show host, television host, publicist, media consultant. He knows everyone out there. Nicholson, Paris Hilton, Crosby, Stills and Nash, Diana Ross, many people, just all of them. He's been on the circuit for decades. And he's still a relatively young man. He just jumped right into it, full immersion. But Elliot Mintz also has the distinction of not having worked with the Beatles, and specifically John Lennon, who went on with as McCartney did, and Harrison, and Ringo to some degree, with solo careers. Elliot Mintz was friends with John Lennon, and is still friends with Yoko Ono, and would go to New York to visit them. There were a few times when Lennon would come with Yoko to L.A., but not often, because I think probably that's because, for the same reason Robert De Niro prefers New York to L.A., because New Yorkers are a bit like the Swiss in one regard. They respect a person's privacy a little bit more than the paparazzi-esque celebrity frenzy that is really prevalent in the LA scene. Anyway, this is going to be a fascinating discussion, and I haven't even had it yet. So you may need to plan on a large cup of your favorite tea. And I understand Elliot Mintz likes his Chardonnay, so depending on the time of day, of course some will say Chardonnay is good at any time of day, but unless it's the morning hours, when tea would be appropriate, perhaps you'll get yourself a glass of Chardonnay and settle in, because based on all the material I have before me, this promises to be a really, really nice conversation with Elliot Mintz next on Caravan to Midnight. Welcome on to Caravan to Midnight, Mr. Elliot Mintz. Yes, you think maybe you've heard that name before. Well, certainly you may indeed have. What a career. In the late 60s, Elliot Mintz had two shows on radio station KPFK in L.A., California. Looking In and Looking Out. In '71, he hosted a Kaiser Broadcasting syndicated television show that integrated musical guests with film clip shots in and around Southern California. In '73, he was entertainment correspondent for Eyewitness News on KABC television in Los Angeles. And notably, he met and became friends with John Lennon and Yoko Ono in 1971. 8 years after John's murder in 1980, he began hosting a weekly syndicated radio series, The Lost Lennon Tapes, which I've personally heard. The show was broadcast globally every week for almost 4 years. The hundreds of hours of broadcast contained unreleased tracks, rehearsals, composing tapes, interviews, and home recordings of John Lennon. Elliot Mintz has appeared in 2 feature documentaries about John Lennon and Yoko Ono. And prior to his career as a media consultant, he spent 10 years as a radio and television talk show host. He interviewed guests on radio stations KMLA, KLAC, KMET, KPPC, KLOS, and KABC in Los Angeles, as well as syndicated radio programs for Interview and Earth News Radio. In addition to entertainers, Elliot Mintz represents CEOs and corporations including Westwood One, Planet Hollywood, Hotel and Casino, Bijan Fragrance, and Penthouse Magazine, consults with record companies as well as motion picture studios, and provides free media advice for charities and causes he supports. He often speaks as an expert on the power and pitfalls of celebrity, the paparazzi, fame, and publicity. Elliot, this is a real treat to have you on the program as we, I realize it was February 9th, 64, when the Fab Four officially invaded the United States, but we're, observing the 50th year of their music just continuing to roll forward. And since you were a man in a position to know and actually, be friends with John Lennon and Yoko, it just seemed natural that we should try to get you to speak to us about your experiences. So welcome.
Thank you so much, John. It's a pleasure to be here.
In speaking with Ken Scott earlier, who was an engineer for almost all of the White Album and also Help and Revolver, he said that, I asked him if George Harrison was was the quiet man that he seemed to be, and he said, oh no, he was actually, once you got him started, it was hard to get him to stop. So, I mean, it's much like seeing people. You hear them on the radio, and then you see them finally, you go, wow, you don't sound a bit like the way you look, or rather, you don't look the way you sound. And you see the pictures and the publicity photos and the stuff on the album covers and so forth, and you think you know how they must be, but you're almost always wrong. So, what was it like to know John? He had almost like certainly a demigod-like status among everyone, beginning as children. And I remember I found out from Harvey Kubernick that I actually was not hallucinating. I actually had seen them on the Jack Parr show in '63, and nobody did anything about it at my school the next day. That they were oblivious to it. But the next day, after they appeared on the Sullivan Show, they had sheets of lyrics written out and all this, and it was quite a compliment to have one of the young older girls there to say, to address you as John Lennon, because and people, the kids were just wild. They were just mad about it, and this continued all the way through adolescence and into adulthood, and we're still fascinated with them. I mean, 50 years later, I'm still in awe of what they did, and most certainly awed by their personalities. John was just one of those people that he never said what you thought he was going to say. So anyway, I'm going to turn it over to you and just tell us how this came about and your impressions of John, if he was a happy person or if he was boisterous or reticent or just clever all the time. He was an extraordinarily clever man.
He was all of those things that you mentioned and more. The fact of the matter is he was an extraordinarily original man. I mean, when I reflect back upon our times together, there were things that he said and did when I was with him that just felt original to me. What do I mean by that? You can be around some people who might sound intellectual. They graduated Harvard or Yale. They've read a lot of books. And they're very good at cross-referencing things, evoking quotes, things of that nature. And, to some degree, that might be an indication of intelligence. Then, from time to time, you find yourself around people who say something to you that you've never heard before. And there is no cross-reference. It is what I would consider to be an original thought. As I say it, I recognize that there probably are no original thoughts left on planet Earth, that everything has been thought. But John was very good at expressing his thoughts. He was also very good at tearing down this invisible veil between audience and performer. I never thought of John as a show-busy kind of guy. And if you look through the long history of his work, not only with the Beatles, but later with Yoko, if you listen to or read his interviews, you will hear him express things, whether you agree or not, that are original, that are different, that are innovative, sometimes magical, sometimes bewildering. When he would give me a call in the evening just to kick it around, sat back, scratched my head, and said, that's really an interesting take on what you've just, what we've been discussing. On the other hand, he was a funny man, and I can't think of John without acknowledging his remarkable sense of humor. He had an acerbic wit that's evidenced in a book that he once wrote, A Spaniard in the Work, and in his various pronouncements. He liked to laugh. He liked to provoke laughter. He saw joy in just simple irony of day-to-day life. He would listen to the Goon shows. He was a funny man. He could be a moody man. He would brood from time to time. When he got serious, he got real serious. So, I've been asked a lot throughout my life, what was John Lennon really like? He was like, he was an amalgamation, a chameleon of many identities, many personalities, but the one thing that always came through is that he was an honest man. He was a truthful man. That what you heard was who he was. There was no show business John on stage versus what it would be like just hanging out with him in a coffee shop. He spoke his mind, and he lived up to his code.
That's somehow that doesn't surprise me. That's just what you want to hear about someone like him. And even his presentation on stage, he just stood there, holding his guitar, and he'd just be, here I am, and here's the song. I heard people, of course, I can't confirm any of this because I never met him, and virtually everything I've had to go on all these years is nothing but hearsay. But someone mentioned that they had asked him, well, do you go back and listen to any of those fabulous songs that you wrote and then performed? And the response was supposedly, no. Once he's finished with a song, he moves on to something else. He just seemed like a rugged individualist, and the one thing that was constant in any of his interviews was he was determined to promote love.
Yep.
Not the kissy, frilly love, but the true brotherly love on a global level. And it makes me wonder, Elliot, why was that such a controversial subject? I mean, why was that such a danger to people? Sometimes I think he would have been left alone if he had sung songs about supporting the troops rather than, give peace a chance.
Well, first of all, just I'll return to the question, but in terms of the observation of the music, he had a wonderful old jukebox at his apartment in Manhattan, and the first time I came to visit him, obviously I was curious to look at the 100 singles that were in the juke, and years later Elton John gave him another jukebox as a birthday or a Christmas present, and we went to downtown record stores in New York to find old 78 RPM records. It was the only thing that juke contained. In John's first jukebox, there were all the songs and all the records that you would expect him to have, including his influences like Jerry Lee Lewis and Chuck Berry and Little Richard and Carl Perkins and all of them. There may have been a smattering of Beatles tunes, maybe 3 or 4, if I remember correctly. We certainly didn't listen to any of the songs together. I interviewed him a number of times, even during the course of our friendship. We did extended radio interviews and a television interview, and I would ask him that from time to time. And he said that there were a couple of songs that he felt really good about. He specifically mentioned I Am the Walrus and Strawberry Fields, that he felt, were demonstrative of his talent and his ability, and he would revisit those songs, give them a listen. But in terms of the early, what we call Beatle ditties. No, he never talked to me about those, and there were no gold records on the walls in the apartment. So his real attention to the music came in his collaborations with Yoko, and he paid attention to those songs and did listen to them. With respect to the love issue, yes, of course, All You Need Is Love was part of what the Beatles were about and part of what John was about. But in addition to that, John added an additional component. He referred to it as peace and love. Well, not many people quarrel with the word love.
Right.
But some people do have an issue with the word peace. And some people may have had an issue with the word peace by attaching some kind of political connotation to it, especially in the 1960s, even to the point of using the term peacenik in a pejorative form. So, look, history has proven that there were many people who advanced and espoused the simple edict of love, from Jesus to Martin Luther King Jr., and hundreds of others, named and unnamed, who engendered anger as a result of the simple pronouncement.
Yeah, you read my mind. I was thinking, yeah, look what they did to Jesus, and I don't recall him preaching anything other than love for each other. It's amazing.
Yes, I mean, if one was to just focus for a moment on the teachings of Christ, and some of your listeners may be aware of the fact that there are these very intriguing Bibles where you can buy the Bible, and what they've done is they've highlighted the words spoken by Christ, as opposed to the Gospels and the words spoken by other prophets, etc. You know, we are just going to the source material of things he said. And if one was to read just the things he said, which advanced his beliefs, I couldn't imagine anybody having any objection with a single utterance. However, once you get into the interpretation of the things he said by others, be it in the Bible or be it through biblical scholars or TV evangelists or whoever, somehow the message might become diluted a bit. So I always advise people, whenever they're making an assessment of what somebody is saying, to try to go to the source and the heart of where things came from. Unfortunately, we don't have any recordings of Christ. We do have virtually all of the recorded speeches of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And if one was to spend 10 years listening to hundreds of hours of tape, I think that you just come away with the concept that what he was advancing would only threaten those who would feel intimidated by the concept of equality.
Yeah.
You know, the people who do have issues with love are the people who sometimes lead loveless lives, and they become envious of those who appear to be happy or who are in love.
That's a very interesting observation. Now, it was obvious, to me at least, that he and Yoko were very, very much in love. And, you know, you hear these things over the years. You know, Yoko broke up the Beatles. And, you know, anybody who was close to them said that's absolute rubbish. That no, she did not. And they just seemed like a really united couple. And he mentioned her many times in his songs, in his lyrics, and I mean I thought that he was just really completely into her, and there was nobody else for him.
Your evaluation is correct, and you are speaking to a fellow who literally spent hundreds and hundreds of hours with the two of them. And I was in a unique position to observe the depth of the love and respect that the two of them shared for each other. They were one of the great loving couples of the 20th century. And I know that a lot of this has been mythologized and dissected and evaluated by people, primarily those who have never met them or spent any time with them. But the level of intrinsic intimacy, trust, sharing, honesty between the two of them, I've never seen replicated in any other couple I've ever known.
If you don't mind my asking, how was this manifested? I mean, did they just handle each other gently with just a soft touch and just almost in a state of continual acknowledgement?
I wouldn't go that far. I wouldn't say that they just walked through Central Park every day holding hands,
right,
and writing love letters to each other, although there was a lot of that as well. But even in their disagreements, and they had disagreements about the issues that we all have disagreements about, they handled their disagreements respectfully. I mean, I never observed a shouting match between the two of them or an exchange of profanities or, anything of the kind. They're extremely independent thinkers. Yoko is one of the most brilliant people I've ever met. She came from a very different world than John came from. She came from an extremely wealthy, aristocratic Japanese family. I guess the plan was to marry her off to some prince or something like that. John was a working-class guy from Liverpool, and Yoko was an avant-garde artist who was well-known in avant-garde circles long before she met or married John. John didn't come from the avant-garde. He came from Elvis. And it was the union of opposites that created this synchronicity, not just in their work and in their public persona, but in their day-to-day lives. He did say to me many times that she was the teacher and he was the student, that she was his Don Juan and he was Carlos Castaneda, and that she was the teacher. She was far more educated and literate, and there is a wisdom and a magic about Yoko that really can't be absorbed unless you spend time with her. I've known her now more than 40 years, and I'm still inspired by some of the things that must have inspired John. They had a colorful relationship. Nothing about it was bland. It was entirely unique, not just because of the way they shared their lives, but because of the lives that they had to live publicly.
For those of us who don't know about that, when you say the lives that they had to live publicly, how can I put this? How would the symptoms of that public life be manifest? In other words, what would we see by way of contrast between their private and their public life? Because John seemed like he just kind of showed up and was himself. He just, in other words, what was there? Do you mean that they that there was just a certain type of deportment that they had to put forth when they were in public, or was there any kind of a yes, we are both here, but I mean no public displays of affection? I mean I know they did the bed and all that. I thought actually that was quite clever, but in other words, how did they act differently in public? I mean, obviously, I'm not talking about what a man and a woman do when they're in the intimate confines of their home, but I mean, as far as attitude that was projected to the public.
If you and I, John, decided to go out for dinner with somebody we had a date with, or somebody who we were in love with, or a wife or a girlfriend, whatever the case might be. Our mission would be to meet someplace or get dressed and get into the car and drive to the restaurant, sit down, have our meal, enjoy ourselves, have a couple of laughs, and then go home. It's the way it is for most people when they go out to dinner.
Sure.
When John and Yoko would go out to dinner, it could turn into a scene. Right. Suddenly they're not just having a dinner, but they first are the object of attention of everybody in the restaurant. They have to deal with people who want to come up and ask for autographs, talk with them, tell John exactly where they were when they first saw him on the Ed Sullivan Show, ask him during dessert when the Beatles are getting back together again, maybe ignoring Yoko, maybe asking if they could take a picture. Maybe there are people on the sidewalk who start crowding around the restaurant, peering through the window of the glass, maybe pushing on the glass a bit. Maybe it's necessary to make arrangements for the car to come around the front or the car to come around the back. Maybe there's an issue of crowd control of too many people. Maybe there's some pushing and maybe there's some shoving. Maybe there, in other words, dinner turns into an event of some kind. Now, look, this was not limited to John and Yoko. Most public figures, I assume that if Brad Pitt and Angelina Jolie decided to have a meal tonight, to some degree they would be facing the same kind of things. But according to the Associated Press in the 1960s, John and Yoko were among the most photographed people of the 20th century. And wherever they went, there would be public scrutiny. Mm-hmm. I can recall distinctly probably the first time I ever visited them at the Dakota. And I don't remember what the year was or the occasion, but they invited me to spend some time with them, and I went there. And we sat in the bedroom. That's where they like to spend most of their time, in their bedroom. Some people prefer living rooms. Some people prefer kitchens. New Yorkers like kitchens. They like the bedroom. And there was a white wicker chair next to the bed, and I would sit there and we would talk. And on one occasion we talked, I don't know, for 3, 4, 5 hours. And either John or Yoko asked if I was hungry. I said I wouldn't mind a little bite. And they decided that there was a small restaurant in the neighborhood where we could grab some sushi. So we left the bedroom, and they just put on an overcoat. It was a winter's day. And, of course, during the course of the conversation in the bedroom, we talked about all the things we talk about that they liked to talk about: religion, politics, social issues, history. John was a big history buff. Seldom talked about music or show business. They had enough of that. And I wasn't a musician. So we would talk about what we would talk about. I would be conscious of the fact, of course, that they were John and Yoko, but that was not the lead. However, we put the scarves on, put the coats on, take the elevator downstairs to the little lobby area, walk out the driveway, and suddenly everything changes. Suddenly you walk out on the sidewalk to get into a cab or a car, and there were dozens and dozens and dozens of people who were coming at you.
Wow.
With record albums to sign, with squealing or screaming, wanting to take pictures next to you, to handing you messages, everything. You'd get into a cab, and the cab driver would turn around and ask when the Beatles are getting back together again. And in other words, the contrast between being with them alone and being with them in public was extremely dramatic.
I'll bet.
For them, you know, they got used to it. John once told me, Elliot, I've always been famous. I was famous when I was 16 in Liverpool. I was famous in school. I put together a little band. We played in a little local place called the Caravan. And people knew who I was. I'd walk down the street when I left the Caravan, I'd go back to my Auntie Mimi's house, and people would say, hello, John, how's it going? That kind of thing. He said the only thing that ever changed in my life by way of fame is that I wound up dancing on a larger stage. So for that reason, that results in a lot of things, because I've spent a lot of time with famous people. For some, it drives them behind gates that they can't emerge from, and they become recluses. For others, they become somewhat indifferent to it and just treat it as, part of the day. John had ambivalent feelings about it. He would say to me in interviews, whenever I quote John, by the way, I never do so without there being documentation behind it, stuff that he said that we recorded for radio programs. He would say to me that from time to time it's okay to be famous. And I don't mind being thought of as, the great one. At times it can be useful. But most of the time, it was an intrusion. It was one of the reasons the two of them elected to make New York City their real home. Because there's one thing about New Yorkers, unlike most people around the world, they're relatively indifferent to celebrity. Either they just don't pay attention, or they're walking too fast, or it's cold out and people are bundled up, or whatever the case is. It's very, very different being with a public figure in Beverly Hills than in Brooklyn. And most people, most of the time in New York left them alone. We'd walk down the block and people would know who they are. They would nod, they would smile, they'd say, hi, John. And they were able to move around fairly easily.
Yeah.
But, we traveled to other places as well. I spent months with them in Japan, and it was quite different there.
So did John and Yoko spend much time in L.A. at all? Because you were doing quite a lot of transcontinental flying to meet with them in New York, or your base was in L.A., yeah?
Correct. Most of my visits with them would involve me going to New York. I'm a single guy. It's easier for me to move around. I'm also Elliot Mintz. I can get on and off of an airplane without photographers waiting. Right. For them to travel is a little bit more complicated, although they did come to L.A. on a number of occasions, visited with me at my home, attended one of my birthdays up at my old house, not far from where I'm speaking to you right now. And they had various things that they did in Los Angeles, but for the most part, home base was New York. That's where they spent most of their time.
I also want to talk quite a bit about your broadcasting career, but we'll segue into that one.
Sure.
Now, when did John and Yoko actually hook up, so to speak? Because I remember she was part of they were together in a little band called the Dirty Mac. I remember seeing that on the Rolling Stones Rock and Roll Circus. And, of course, everybody just looked so young in those days. I suppose they were. And then later, the Plastic Ono Band. So, I mean, he involved her in I guess, as much as he could.
Yes. I mean, look, he really he got her artistry. They met in an art gallery in England when she was about to do one of her avant-garde art shows, and either the curator of the gallery or a friend had spoken about this avant-garde Japanese artist who was going to do this show. John became intrigued by it and went to a preview of the opening, met her, they interacted with each other, and he liked her immediately. And that was the beginning of their relationship. They were virtually inseparable. As I recall, the first time that Yoko heard John was when she was in a bookstore, I think in Japan. There was music playing over the speaker. And one of the songs that came through was John singing Help. And she heard in that voice, in that song, a real cry for help, which is what that song was all about. And if your listeners go to their machines after our conversation and replay just that one, it was emblematic of John sharing all of his emotions, no matter what they were. He would write a song later called Jealous Guy. He would write Help. He wrote a song called God about the things he didn't believe in. In other words, he used his music as a form of he used it aesthetically, and he used it almost as a form of journalism. And he communicated to us directly, and sometimes without any of the veils and nuances. So when they met, it was instant. They didn't want to be apart. They wanted to collaborate. They wanted to live with each other, love each other, and change the world.
Elliot, what do you make of some of these negative things that have come down the that certainly the negative things are sure to follow anything positive. I mean, once you get out into the world of the public, you're going to get hit with all sorts of things. I mean, just in my own infinitesimally small celebrity or whatever you might call it, it's like there are suggestions of everything from I tell people, well, depending on which email or contact you hear, which email you read or which contact you hear from, I am alternately a Zionist, a Nazi, a left-winger, a right-winger, a genius, or an idiot. It just depends on who you're talking to and what fragment they think that I heard, and then they took it and ran. But there's some fellow out there named, I want to say his name is Fulton, that was saying, John Lennon was a rough customer and sang about peace and all that, but actually he was quite abusive and all that. But it's funny because it seems to me like that sort of a scandal would have been widespread if there was any truth to it.
Well, he was hardly an abusive man, and of course I've read all of those kinds of tell-all books. There were a slew of them that were published after his death, and one of the things that the people who wrote the books almost all had in common was that they never knew him. They never met him.
Right.
So they were building on, quote, sources or imagination, kind of like as you described it in your life, things that have been said or written about you. Well, it usually is an extension of the perception of the person who's doing the writing. I think Freud referred to it as transference.
Yeah.
And whatever they don't like in themselves, they decide to lay upon you. It's easier to dislike you than to confront their own demons. It is just the nature of being public. About a year ago, I was reading this piece. It was a review of a book that had been published about Mother Teresa. And the author, who claimed to have done extensive research, had these negative things to say about Mother Teresa. I didn't buy the book. I finished the review. When I finished the review, I just took a walk outside, got some fresh air, and I thought to myself, if somebody can fill 300 pages of a book and have complaints about Mother Teresa, then no one on planet Earth is going to be exempt from criticism.
Really, no one is safe.
So even when clients come to me when I wear my media hat, I just say to them, look, for every fan that you pick up, for every person who recognizes the uniqueness of your artistry, I promise you, maybe there won't be an equal number, but there'll be X number of people who will feel exactly the opposite. And you've got to have a really tough skin if you're going to dance in the spotlight. And it's not just in celebrity. I'm going to deviate from what we're talking about to broadcasting for just a second. I think you'll be able to relate to this, John, and maybe some of our friends in the audience. Years ago when I used to do telephone talk radio and I was on the other end of these kinds of calls, I worked at some local radio station in Los Angeles, and I remember walking in, it was a Sunday, I did weekend talk shows then, and I said something like this: good afternoon, everybody. My name is Elliot Mintz. You're listening to dot, 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 dot. It's a great, beautiful day in Los Angeles, 75 degrees, clear, sunny. Today we're just going to do open phones, no guests, just you and I. So here are the telephone numbers. I want you to call up and tell me anything that's on your mind. And just keep in mind that when you're talking with me, you are probably also sharing your thoughts with more people than you're going to reach in your entire lifetime. So be kind. We'll be right back after these commercials. Went to the commercials, came out of the commercials, pushed the phone, and I said, hello, Elliot Mintz, you're on the air. And the very first call was somebody who said, Mr. Mintz, did you just say it's a very nice day in Los Angeles? And I said, I certainly did. He said, well, I live in Pacoima, and it's cloudy out here. It's overcast. And I realized at that moment, early on in my radio career, that no matter what you say on air, no matter what you say to a group of people, you will find somebody who is going to disagree with you.
Oh, yes.
If you say it's sunny out, believe me, there is somebody who's going to be jumping all over you talking about the clouds. So if you take any position, especially in the kind of polarized society that we live in right now, take a position on anything and just know that 50% of the people who are listening feel the complete opposite. So what are you going to do about it? You're either going to be silent on the radio, take no position, or you're going to try to prepare yourself for what's about to come at you. Now, how you deal with it is really the issue. If you can deal with it with grace, being receptive to other people's points of view, that's what I try and do. Or you can be combative, trying to talk louder than them, try to convince them that you're right, they're wrong, etc. But the nature of discord is just part of the human condition. Returning to our initial point, when you're dealing with celebrity, when you're dealing with a John Lennon, of course, if a person portrays themselves in the light of espousing things like peace and love, well, any detractor is going to try and say anything that's going to debunk that by asserting the exact opposite.
Yeah. Well, that that makes complete sense. And in every department, it seems to me that rule, I think that rule applies just being out in public. I mean, whether you're in the high school, the college level, or even the workplace, there are just some people that no matter what you say or do, they're not going to be all right with it. And I think people would do well to remember that. I mean, it's so simplistic to go back to you just can't please all of the people all of the time. You'll be doing well to please 50% of them. It's the percentage that you gave. Half of them are going to say they're going to take exception to what you say.
And of course, a lot of it has to do with the times we live in. I don't remember my parents ever complaining about this phenomena. I was raised in a neighborhood in New York City, and kind of a lower middle class neighborhood, nice people. And folks seemed to get along with each other. Now, I was raised in a home where I was told that it's best not to discuss religion, sex, or politics around the dinner table, but frankly, they were the only subjects that interested me at the time. And my parents were certainly open to a dialogue with me and my sister. And I remember growing up, people having different points of view. They could express it and let go of it. The times have become more complicated. The ways of bullying people and trying to hurt them through the internet, anonymously and cowardly, tell-alls, 24-hour cable television, having to fill the stuff somebody is doing well and feel negative towards them, or people who are doing well who look at people who are not doing well, saying, I don't know why my tax dollars should go to help them. They're not even trying to find a job. In other words, I think what's happening here is we are changing as individuals. Our attention span is growing shorter, which creates a heightened degree of impatience. The amount of media messages that we're barraged with on a daily basis has become intolerable. The day-to-day brutality of American life has put people in a kind of funk. And this is no longer the 1950s Norman Rockwell America.
Yep.
And it's up to each of us to decide how we're going to relate to it, the people we love, and ourselves.
You know, well, rather than making a statement, I'll ask a question. Would you agree that what's become known now as popular music for popular culture? I mean, these phrases, these catchphrases and labels, they take hold and people begin to use them, and I'm not certain they really know what they mean. But just the mass audience, meaning you really don't know what their disposition is. They're just on the other end of the radio broadcast, that's all. Would you agree that their attitudes are shaped by a phenomenon like the Beatles, or is it just is it a permanent shift? Is it just is it an ongoing, lingering amusement, or maybe even entertainment, or do these events, like the advent of a musical group like these fellows, who really did change everything? I mean, no one can deny they didn't influence absolutely every band out there, but they opened the door to just an unbelievable spectrum of innovation. Are these permanent affectations on a civilization, or are they temporary? Are they eventually forgotten, and then the civilization picks up from the point where what's come before is somewhat forgotten, and then morph into something else? Or is there a lingering influence that hangs with us, much like a Mozart or a Beethoven? People don't listen to them every day, but many people they'll hear that lilt and they'll say, "Oh, that's Mozart." Or they'll hear the dark, thunderous stuff and they'll say, "Oh, well, that's Bach or that's Beethoven." Beethoven was, of course, the darkest of them all. You know, Bach was so technically excellent and so forth. I mean, I'm wandering around here, but it's like once the effect has taken place, is it a permanent effect or is it a temporary effect?
I think it's a profound question. I've never been asked it. I haven't given it a great deal of thought. So I'm going to give you, what enters my consciousness at this moment. I think that the key word here has to do with civilization. Now, if we're talking about civilization going on, let's say, for another 50 years or 100 years or 200 years, I think Lennon and McCartney, Rodgers and Hammerstein, Beethoven, Bach, and Elvis, and Dylan, and a variety of others will be sung, studied, appreciated, revered, etc., for hundreds of years to come. If we're talking about the span of civilization that might last hundreds of thousands or millions of years, maybe not. Maybe not. I don't know how many of us would go to the Library of Congress and research music or listen to music that was written, let's say, before the turn of the century. Folkways Records used to document early blues singers before Muddy Waters, Lightning Hopkins, people of that nature, early jazz artists. I think that we do have a way of putting cultural phenomena on a back shelf when it no longer serves us over the course of time. However, if we're talking about the next few hundred years, certainly Elvis Presley, only thing in life that lasts is the stuff that's real. It's the difference between that which is trending and that which is with us. How old is Casablanca? Is it 50, 60 years ago? That song that Dooley Wilson played on the piano?
72 years.
Pardon me?
72 years.
72 years.
Yep.
72 years. Here we are, 72 years after we heard As Time Goes By. And I don't know if you can walk into any piano bar in America, or I don't know if you can hear the first few notes of that song without it touching a place in your heart. I think that can be said about Paul's song, Yesterday. I think 72 years from now, the song Yesterday would have as much meaning and depth as Time Goes By. And the same would be so of Like a Rolling Stone or Strawberry Fields Forever.
I mean no patronage whatsoever when I say I completely agree with you. It is in fact a timeless creation. It really
Yes.
is.
And can you imagine what a marvelous sensation that must be for the person who wrote the song or who created the song? One said to John, "It must give you great pleasure to think of all the people who made love listening to your music." He was very touched by that observation. He said he had heard it before. So, just think of what it must be like. Maybe Beethoven in his compositions, which certainly are dark by my standards, a musical version of Ingmar Bergman movies, but maybe he wanted us to sense the pain and the trauma. Maybe he wanted to touch us on that level and in that way. And he did. And it's permanent.
How old was he? He was only, 21 or 3 or some ridiculously young age?
He was, my recollection is that he was in his 20s.
Oh, yeah. No doubt.
I mean, if you go back to classic literature and look at some of these authors who wrote 20, 30, 40 volumes of work before they turned 40 or 50, it's staggering. It's just staggering. But then again, it doesn't have to be in the numbers. Somebody can do one song. Somebody can make one speech. Somebody can write one book that changes everything, as long as it strikes a resonant chord in the hearts of the people who are experiencing it.
Yes, I suppose that must be true. That must be true.
I mean, I'm certain that the Mercury Theater did many, many radio dramas, but when Orson Welles did War of the Worlds on Halloween night, it was a moment in time in broadcasting that will be eternal. It was a moment, the kind of moment you remember when Walter Cronkite took his glasses off, looked up at his studio clock, and pronounced President Kennedy dead.
Yeah.
Or Man on the Moon.
Oh,
or
yes.
the Beatles arriving in New York City. There are just these moments in time that will stay with you forever. And at the risk of sounding fossilized here, let us also keep in mind what it meant to another generation of kids the first time they watched the video of Thriller.
Yeah. What? There must be a name for those moments. What? I think one of the great science fiction authors actually, it was Arthur Clarke or perhaps Heinlein or one of them named those points, those monolithic points in time that they just endure.
If it was a monolithic point, it would have had to have been Arthur Clarke.
Yeah. Well, I don't know. I just pulled that one out, Elliot. I'm not sure he said monolith, but yeah, I take your meaning absolutely. There was a piece written here. I'm not sure. I'm looking at a stack of papers here, and I'm not sure that you wrote it or if it was written about you. It's an interview. But anyway, the quote is yours, and you, according to this, said that most celebrities that you've met are not the happiest people. Going back to John, was John a happy person, or was he a brooding, moody artist, and that was his happiness, and I mean the love of his work and the love of his girl?
I can only speak to the time that I knew him.
Right.
I met him in 1971 and knew him from then until 80. And of course, I can only speak from first-person knowledge when we were speaking or I was in his company. I would describe him as basically a happy person and a relatively upbeat and optimistic person. I can tell you that after the birth of his son, Sean, in 1975, Sean and John shared the same birthday, October 9th. And from the time of Sean's birth, for the remaining 5 years of John's life, that was the happiest I had ever seen him. He was more content during that time than in the years prior to that. And I saw them a lot. I would go to New York for Christmases and Thanksgivings and birthday parties. I think the last time I visited him was somewhere in October or November of 1980. And it was all about the baby. It was all about Sean. And that was the joy of his life. I would describe John primarily as a happy person, but somebody who, of course, like the rest of us, could have his moods as well.
Well, sure, he was human, but you know, I think that speaks volumes of any person when they adore their children and when their children really bring them happiness, rather than treating them as some sort of an appendage that needs to be dealt with by a surgeon as soon as possible, so to speak.
No, that was certainly not the case between John and Sean. And I met Sean when he was about a week old. They invited me to come to New York to meet him, and I did. He'll be 40 in October.
Oh, and this is impossible. I don't believe it.
And I have known him and been with him hundreds and hundreds of occasions since that first visit, which he does not remember with great clarity. And, I think to myself sometime that Sean only had 5 years with his father.
Oh.
That was it. Just 5 years. But when I sit and talk with him and he reflects or attempts to recall, and he can recall moments, it's through the prism of having been 5 at the time. But when he speaks to me about those moments with his dad, his eyes light up.
Really?
Yeah.
Sorry, I just kind of needed a moment.
Yeah.
I'll tell you what. How would you feel about taking 3 minutes, freshen up a cup of tea, and come right back?
In my case, it'll be a glass of Chardonnay, and talk to you in 3 minutes.
All right, sounds good. This is Caravan to Midnight. We're speaking with Elliot Mintz in celebration of the 50 years since America was changed by a different kind of revolution, one of music. We'll be right back. Remarkable career, and your career continues. It's not as though you've retired from it. But So were you drawn to radio originally, and then the media consultant and the consultancy business and all of that followed? Was radio your first love, or I mean, what actually led you to your work?
I graduated high school in Manhattan and escaped and arrived in Los Angeles when I was, I think, 17 years old.
Escaped.
In 1963, and attended Los Angeles City College. I was always a very poor student in school, and applied, of course, to 20 colleges and was only accepted by one, the community college in L.A. So I came here. Once I got here, I found out that L.A. City College had a wonderful broadcasting department, and I always loved radio and television. They were my friends growing up in New York. I was a kind of shy, withdrawn kid, not very social. I also had a chronic stutter. I had a speech impediment. So I spent a lot of time listening to people on the radio who influenced me a lot. And I thought broadcasting sounded like a good bet. And also to take speech therapy classes, stuff like that, so I could learn how to talk, lose the New York accent. And I studied it for 2 years. I don't think I took any other classes at LA City College. When I was 21 or 22 years old, I got my first job in radio, hosting a talk show at age 21 or 22. One of those people who document stuff in radio say that I may have been the youngest talk show host in America. And I started, and I continued in radio, I guess, for close to 10 years, going from station to station to station, eventually becoming the eyewitness news correspondent for ABC in Los Angeles, KABC television, interviewing rock and roll people, actors, actresses on radio. I did over 2,000 interviews with guests, eclectic guests, unusual guests, and people emblematic of the times that I lived through. I got tired of radio, and I was at a point in my life where I knew what the needs were of the media. I knew what radio needed or TV needed from celebrities. I'd also met hundreds of well-known people as a result of my job. So I decided to cross the street and said to a couple of them, look, I don't want to do the other thing anymore, but if you need some help, some consultation in terms of getting your message across or selling your product, whatever it might be, maybe we could form a relationship. And I started taking on 1, 2, 3 clients. It grew from there. And I've been a media consultant for the better part of the past 20 years or so. And now I'm in rehearsals for retirement.
So actually, well then, what year would it be then that you started your career in radio?
If I came to Los Angeles in 1963, my guess is that I started in radio in 1965.
Wow, what a perfect time to come onto
gosh.
that scene.
It couldn't have been better. I mean, just landing in Los Angeles from New York and seeing Malibu, California for the first time, not in a movie theater with Annette and Frankie, but actually seeing Malibu, seeing palm trees, riding in a convertible, listening to the Beach Boys. It was, one could not have picked the more angelic time to have arrived here, begun to study here, begun to work here, to be in radio in the 60s, just prior to the dawn of underground radio and late-night FM programs. I loved broadcasting. I loved everything about it. I loved the theater of the mind. And my radio shows were basically conversational in nature, just like yours. From time to time I would play records, but for the most part it would just be having conversations with people and opening the telephones so I could listen to them. My granny once told me that the good Lord gave you 2 ears and 1 mouth, so you should listen twice as much as you speak. It was one of my admonitions as an interviewer to try to pose a question, shut up, get out of the way, and allow the guest to speak. So I learned through radio. That was my education. I had the best teachers in the world sitting across the desk from me, and it represented the formative years of my life.
Well, all right then, here comes the inevitable question. What do you find deficient in radio these days? Has it just been monetized into mediocrity? Because I find that it's just become this homogenous goo. The only thing that's really interesting out there now is talk radio, but the bulk of it is political talk, and it's the same political talk all day. The left-right paradigm, which I think should be destroyed, and completely. And I've done my best to destroy it, but I put a dent in it, but I haven't destroyed it.
Well, I'm not in favor of destroying anybody's right of freedom of expression, and I do believe that there's an appropriate amount of time on air that should be devoted to political discussion or debate. I wish it was a little bit more civil, but there should be room for that. What there also should be room for are the myriad of other subjects, formats, music, guests, and experiences that have been closed out as a result of this kind of vituperative, pointless exchange of sound bites that have now been turned into sound barks, and one person wearing the white hat, one person wearing the black hat, and seeing who can talk louder than the other or be more interruptive. The soul has gone out of radio. Yes, it has been monetized to a point where, when I started in radio, we referred to being on a radio station. Today, the reference is being in a radio market.
Yes.
When, if you read the works of Marshall McLuhan and early media observers, they would tell you that the original concept here was that if you put on a really interesting program, radio or television, advertisers would come to you to bring their message to the public. What we have now is advertisers telling you what kind of programming to create to bring the audience to the corporation, to brand the audience. It's a very significant distinction here as to who's working for who.
Yes.
So you have that element. You have the absence of originality. You have this constraint in terms of time. Nobody has time anymore. You can't breathe on radio. Everything has to be done in rapid fire pace because of limited attention spans. And to some degree, radio is now thought of as an antiquated way for people to communicate with each other. This is sad. Just as television, as we knew it to be, is being replaced by the computer, and that the grand movie theaters that we went to see the movies that changed our lives are now available to people who are perfectly content watching the movie play out on their smartphone on a 3x3-inch screen. And the music that you hear on radio could be more accessible via iTunes or Pandora or any of these other delivery systems. So somewhere in the process, you buy a new car today or you lease a new car today, you don't have a radio with radio stations that you put the selection buttons on. You have this computer that, the music gets to you somehow through a new method, but it's different. The hardware is different. There are no mahogany iPods.
Right.
And, of course, the most significant difference is that there was a time that people listened to radio together. My family listened to it around a big box in our small living room in Manhattan. The transistor changed that. The transistor was the original iPod. It was something small that you could fit in your breast pocket with an earpiece. Suddenly you weren't sharing music with others. It was a one-on-one relationship. I came of age listening to music on a jukebox at the local pizza joint. It was the background to socializing with my friends, or maybe dancing or touching a 14 or a 15 or a 16-year-old girl as a teenager. The new delivery systems are designed to keep you indoors and locked up, and certainly not to include with other people in the room. So, I'm going on a bit, but in specific answer to your question, radio has changed for economic reasons, technical reasons, social reasons, and a seeming air of indifference. That's why all the stations play the same music, and all the music seems to sound very much alike.
It seems to be the stuff almost of conspiracy theory development, you know? It's, how could this happen? I mean, why? I think we've already covered it. It's just everything's been monetized to this point where everything is not, it's not a broadcast, it's a narrowcast. And you're branding the audience rather than the station being branded. It's the reverse now. I just wonder, where's the tipping point? How, I mean, do you, now you're a media consultant, so, and actually, I'd really like to have a definition of what that means today. But many people, let me just say that many people I've spoken to think that terrestrial radio is in trouble, that it just doesn't have that much to bring to the party, so to speak, anymore. And as I hear you speak of these things, I wonder if we're not related distantly in some way, because I agree with so much of what you say. Originality is that's not the idea anymore. It's all, I like to say fashion is about blending in, and style is about standing out, and there's not much style these days. So I just wonder how much farther it can be monetized.
I agree with everything you said, and I do feel that terrestrial radio, as we knew it, is gone, and what's left of it, as it is, will be rapidly fading. It will be replaced by extraterrestrial service systems, podcasts, a variety of other ways that people will get what they need to get, shy of listening on a radio. As for it being conspiratorial in nature, the only thing that's conspiratorial in nature are those advertisers who have found these enormously clever ways of sucking you in to buying products that you don't need or want, that they're convincing you must be a component of your life to guarantee you some degree of happiness. This has occurred primarily by very, very smart marketing techniques and planning on their part. Read the Vance Packard book, The Hidden Persuaders. But primarily, as is the case with so many of these issues, we blinked. We, as an audience, looked the other way. We became indifferent. We just weren't paying attention. And in our moments of distraction, many of the things about American culture and American life were just laid upon us. Nobody took a survey, nobody took a poll. They just decided what would be best. And we said, ho-hum, and wrote a monthly check.
Wow. I mean no patronage when I say that's absolute genius. That is so absolutely spot on. Yeah, and you you use the word extraterrestrial. It's true. I know you've heard about the There's one group, the Outer Net, that wants to bring it to us for free via low-orbit satellites. And then I think it's a Chinese firm that wants to actually bring programming to us, or content as it's now known. Like you were saying, I thought I lived in a city, but it turns out it's a market. They want to send it to us from the moon via laser. So I don't know.
Yeah, if we're living and existing in markets, then we have become the produce. And whether the delivery systems originate from the moon or a black hole, if it's devoid of content, it can't triumph. In other words, the one thing that remains still for now is that the public does demand a certain aesthetic. It might not be one that you and I completely embrace musically or culturally, but obviously the numbers indicate that there are X millions of people who like the way things are right now and would certainly prefer getting their music right now via iTunes than putting on a coat and going to their local record store and going through the vinyl bins, which we found very, very attractive, which 15 and 16-year-olds today do not. So part of me wants to honor the fact that each generation finds their own way of enjoying their own experiences. That does not mean I cannot lament the erosion of the experiences that formed my life.
Yeah.
I have this Facebook page. I'm not a big computer guy or internet guy. I'm going to launch my first internet site in a couple of weeks. I've never done that before. I'm a little late to the rodeo. I just thought it was time. I've been working on it for a couple of years. So in not having a website, I use Facebook to express some of my thoughts. And I did a piece last night about running into Taylor Swift over the weekend. Today, Billboard published their survey of the highest earners of music in the past year. Taylor Swift came out on top. She made $40 million last year.
Is that all?
Her music.
Wow.
She surpassed the earnings of the Rolling Stones, as well as Beyonce and Justin Bieber and a variety of the others. And she's 22 years old. She writes primarily for 15-year-old girls. The songs are rather simplistic. She was absolutely charming. I had a lovely conversation with her. But I recognized, and I put it in the piece, that for X number of 15-year-old girls, Taylor Swift is their Beatles.
Yeah. Wow.
John, can you hear me? I'm hearing some static.
No, I've got you. Yeah, it goes back. I hope this isn't too simplistic, and I don't expect you to tolerate it if it is. Just pull the reins up, and I'll stop running with it. But it's that life imitating art or art imitating life. It's both. First, art imitates life, and then life begins to imitate art. And I'm just wondering, what are we going to see manifested in life after it imitates the current strain of art?
I think it's synergistic.
Yes?
I tend to think that we gravitate to cultural phenomena because it resonates in our own hearts. I think Baba Ram Dass once said, "You never fall in love with another person. You only fall in love with in a place in yourself that another person brings you to."
Oh, that's very interesting.
Maybe, the huge number of sales from rap artists areas, that's who purchases gangster rap, is speaking to a place within them of anger. That one is picking up where the other is leading off. So that Jay-Z or Snoop, or whoever it might be talking to a 15-year-old kid living in a rural area of Wyoming who's angry and can just relate to the anger or the frustration through the music. Although they seem to be two disparate experiences taking place, I think it's one of the same. If we go back to 1963 for a moment, in the wake of the sadness of the assassination of Kennedy and America's malaise, the Beatles arrived at a moment where we really needed a lift. And their first message to us, their first pronouncement and declaration was, quote, "I want to hold your hand."
Yeah.
Close quote.
Oh, yeah.
It's what we needed to hear. Well, among a generation today, they might need to hear something else. Although I am heartened by the fact that if one looks at record sales and the numbers, an enormous number of teenagers are just discovering the Beatles for the very first time and liking them.
Yes. Yep. Wow. That's good. That's you. Well, you've just put forth quite a lot to chew on, quite a lot to digest. That's. Would you mind telling me and us one more time, who was that says you don't really fall in love with someone, it's that you're with someone that awakens a piece of yourself?
His name is Baba Ram Das.
Oh, gotcha. Now I know who you mean. That's.
He lives in Hawaii now, where he does his darshans and still does recordings and occasional lectures. I'd interviewed him a number of times. I followed his odyssey. Very intriguing character, and if any of your listeners liked that particular quote, two books, one called Be Here Now, and the other one, The Only Dance There Is, by Baba Ram Das. It's a Hindu expression for student of God. Very intriguing man. He also said something else while we're on the subject. Let me just take a sip of my Chardonnay, clear my throat.
Please. Kind of missing mine right now.
He also said something that sticks with me. He said that nothing is ever learned, only remembered. So, whenever I say something to you or you say something to me and one of us say, aha, what you're doing, or what I'm doing, is reminding you of a place in yourself where you knew it anyway. And here we are again.
Yeah, that's a kind of a favorite expression of mine. It's like, I knew that, I just wanted to hear you say it.
Yes. And I wanted to confirm through you that I'm not alone.
Yes. You know,
because the madman in the corner who feels isolated needs the confirmation that he's not mad at all.
it's really great talking to you. You have such expansive thoughts. You really do, and they're just excellent. I'm just reveling in this. I'm glad that I'm being photographed in shadow. Otherwise, I would be putting all sorts of unusual faces on as I just try to absorb this as rapidly as possible. Well,
thank you. You're too kind.
Well, I mean it. I really mean it, Elliot. Now, are you still doing you're still a publicist, yes?
Media consultant. Now, media consultant is a little bit like 50% publicist, 25% manager, advisor, hand holder, spin doctor. I meet with people. They come to me, and some of them are very famous people, and they say, look, I want to get my record out, or my book out, or my movie plugged, but I really don't want to do morning chat shows, and I don't want to appear as if I'm hungry. How do we get it out? I advise them about that. Other people who get into some kind of problems or troubles or misrepresented by the media for something that they may or may not have done, who might come to me and say, what would be the best public posture to take, having to do with this thing I'm accused of. Other people come to me and say, I'm too famous.
Right.
I'm overly exposed and I need to engage in media reduction.
Wow.
So how can you reduce the media image but not make me disappear? Other people have disappeared and they're looking for resurrection. Other people come to me just wanting to talk about makeovers, or how should I change this? How do I move from television into movies? Or a variety of media-related questions, issues, and answers. With some who I like, this is not terrible stuff to do. But last month I had my 69th birthday, so I'm now just shy of 12 months for my 70th. And for the past 2 or 3 years, I've been trying to figure out a way of getting out of doing all of this stuff and getting on with the real essential things in life, and not be caught up in the media world, which of course can become somewhat taxing.
Yeah, I'm sure that's true. Well, what are the essential things in your view?
Well,
the few.
I wouldn't mind moving out of Beverly Hills to a more rural setting.
Right.
I love horses. That's my sport. I like horseback riding. I'd like to be around horses. I like to be around folks who are a little bit closer to the earth than most of the people I run into in restaurants in Rodeo Drive. I'd like to go back to school and take some night classes and study some of the things that I never got around to studying. I'd like to learn a second language. I'd like to study art, philosophy, religion, anthropology, astronomy. Those things really intrigue me. I'd like to travel to places I've never been to that I just had to go to with clients, like the Cannes Film Festival, or things like that. I want to go on my own path.
Yeah.
I'd like to devote more time to meditation, reflection. I'd like to reread books that I read too early and didn't understand or get. I'd like to sleep later. I'd like to use the media skills that I've learned over the course of my life to help various charities and philanthropic groups that I believe in on a pro bono basis, to use the same devices to help them with their experience. When John and Yoko did the bed-ins in the 60s, John said, look, we're going to announce to the press that we're celebrating our honeymoon by getting into bed to 7 days in a hotel room in Canada. We'll invite the media in every day. Hundreds of them would come in, and they would be having all kinds of expectations of the ex-Beatle and his Japanese wife in bed together. And once he got them into the room, the two of them did marathon interviews and conversations about peace. And he said, look, we're going to sell peace the way Madison Avenue sells toothpaste. That's our product. That's what we're going to get out there. That's what we're going to push. I have found in my experience that with respect to the media, you can use it to promote a rock star, and you can also use it to tap into somebody's conscience to help bring about an end to any one of the number of causes and charities that I support and believe in. The first one is something called Rhett Syndrome, which most people have never heard of course. R-E-T-T syndrome. Think of it as the most advanced state of autism coupled with neurological inabilities to physically move. It always affects little girls, usually around the age of 3 or 4, by the hundreds of thousands. You can have a happy, healthy little child with a working vocabulary, and within the course of 3 days, they lose all their words, they can't speak, they can't move, and they can't chew food. And nobody knows what causes it. You can look up Rhett Syndrome by Googling it.
Oh, I will.
So I have offered my support to a marvelous group called the Rhett Syndrome Research Trust, and I want to make I want people to know what Rhett is. I want people to know about that organization. I will use whatever media skills that I've learned to put that front and center. It's my belief, John, that when enough people know about enough things, everything changes. It's the 100th monkey theory.
I've never heard of this. Never
So
heard of this.
part of what I'm going to be doing in my second scene of my third act will be to devote time to those causes. I also want to sleep more and maybe find the future Mrs. Mintz and get married, something that I have not yet done.
Well, there's no need to get in a hurry.
It's only said to me by people who've had been through the experience and things didn't quite work out. But it's something that I still entertain. It's the romantic in me. I still listen to that song as time goes by. And I'd like to drink great wines, and I'd like to have fun, and I'd like to laugh, and I'd like to be around my godchildren more often. In other words, when I say the real stuff, the people sometimes get scared about the word retirement and say, how could you give this stuff up, this exciting life that you lead, to something as mundane as the picture you painted? To me, it is the real stuff.
Well, it's the few hours of real living, as Emerson put it. You know? Now,
Yes, truly living.
Now, are you a 5A? This is a little bit personal. If it's certainly you don't have to answer, and I don't expect that you would if you didn't want to. But are you a 5 a.m. guy?
That's when I go to sleep.
You go to sleep at 5 a.m.
Yes. I've been an insomniac most of my life. That's different than somebody who has an occasional sleep disorder and swallows an Ambien. Since I was 16 or 17, I don't sleep. In every 24-hour cycle, I get about 4 hours.
Oh, boy.
And my rhythms put me to sleep at around 5 o'clock in the morning, and I get up, I get out of bed at around noon. No deep REM sleep. I've tried everything, of course, and consulted with professionals. Some people just don't sleep. That's just the reality. And there is no known cure for insomnia. It's just treated symptomatically. And the medications and things of that nature, ultimately, after 30 or 60 days, the brain catches on to what you're doing. So when you ask me if I'm a 5 a.m. kind of guy, I am.
Just not the one I was thinking.
No, not that one.
Right, the other one. Wow, that's amazing. Now this thing that you're into, I want to get into this more, this Rhett Syndrome. I will be looking into that, and we'll make our listeners and viewers aware of this cerebroatrophic hyperammonemia. I never heard of such a thing. Is this widespread?
If you look up, I'm so delighted that you're giving me a moment to make mention of this, because when I do my various interviews, usually about the Beatles or Paris Hilton or whoever people want to talk to me about, I do always try to get a moment or two in for this. If people Google Rhett Syndrome Research Trust, or just Google Rhett Syndrome, it'll lead you to this organization that's on the forefront of finding a learn all about it. It's completely mysterious to me. And I've met families and their little girls who suffer from this. It is absolutely heartbreaking. And I just know that with the scientific community and with the consciousness and awareness of others, we can change it. I'd like to get RSRT mentioned not only on your show, but on other shows, national shows. I want to put it in the forefront. And it's all going to be about the science.
Yes.
That one day, two scientists are going to pour something into a test tube, and there'll be something. And by the way, symptoms of Rhett syndrome, and I want people to just think about this for a moment. You brought your healthy child home from the hospital, little girl. She's doing everything that all the other 3-year-old little girls do. And in the course of a week, everything changes. She can't walk. She can't talk. She can't move. She can't chew. She has no vocabulary. She stares at you.
Oh,
and it's
Lord.
possible that the child is aware of what the child is going through. It's Rhett syndrome.
Oh my gosh, how heartbreaking. Yes, it's rsrt.org. And
Let's do something about that.
yes, why don't we? As a matter of fact,
Find that it starts with you feeling that that's intolerable, and that we as a society can correct it.
oh, this is terrible. Loss of speech and motor control, functional hand use replaced by compulsive hand movements, disordered breathing, severe digestive problems, orthopedic abnormalities including scoliosis and fragile bones, disrupted sleep patterns, extreme anxiety, seizures, impaired cardiac and circulatory function, and Parkinsonian tremor in the course of a week?
Affecting thousands and thousands and thousands of little girls in America and around the world as we speak tonight, John. I trust your audience will do the right thing.
Well, I'll tell you what. This won't be the last. If I have my way about it, Elliot, this won't be the last time that we talk, because I think we ought to get into this right away. We've been thinking about what is some sort of charitable work that we can do. Good grief, I mean, there's just a plethora of things that need to be addressed out there, but I don't know, little girls going from fully functioning little girls to all of these symptoms that I just listed. I mean, if you had not brought this up, I would not even know this existed. Apparently it was only detected 25 years ago.
Correct.
Wow. Okay.
And God bless you if you're interested.
I'm completely interested in it. In fact, no, we'll get into it. After all, it's only, what is this? No, it's only Tuesday. So
Yep.
Yes, we will. I don't know why, but well, yes, I guess I do. I don't give out too much information about who comprises the Wells clan, but I can just say that I can only imagine. In fact, I can't imagine what it must be like for a parent to have this visited upon their daughter.
None of us can, and with your permission, at a future moment, when I speak with your producer, I will put your producer in touch with a parent of a child suffering from Rhett, or the director of the Rhett Syndrome Research Trust.
Excellent.
In the hopes that you might do an interview, have a conversation, and learn more.
As an old lawyer, a Chicago expatriate used to say, you can write it on the wall. It shall be done.
Bless you.
Yeah, well, bless you for bringing it to our attention, and a lot of people out there. And this is the wonderful thing about the internet is once something gets up there, it tends to hang around for a while. So this is good. No, I'm serious, Elliot. We'll get into it. This is I don't have any more words other than we'll get into it, and we will.
Bless you.
Well, Well, sorry, I'm just trying to shift my mind off of this. I need to change pages because I keep looking at that little girl there, and it's not, I can't go on, and I'm just going to shut the screen there, and I'll open it back in a little while. Say, what's going on with some of this behavior that we see during the Grammy Awards and so forth? Is this sensationalistic mania of some sort? Is it just marketing, or has the Illuminati taken hold of everything? As some conspiracy theorists, including myself, have wondered about, and we're all being cast in the image of Lucifer, and we're about to experience the everlasting bonfire as a result of our folly. I mean, what's happening?
I haven't seen any evidence of reptilian intervention in the Grammy Award show.
Good.
And among the voting committee, I'm not aware of a separate Illuminati chapter.
Right.
I tend to think of the Grammy Awards as being basically a reflection of the musical tastes of America. And, of course, when it comes to the Grammys or the Oscars, what these things are, of course, are advertisements. They are marketing tools to sell records and to help actors and actresses get bigger fees for doing their movies. That's why we have them.
Right.
On a secondary level, at the risk of sounding sexist, women have this unusual preoccupation with looking at shoes, followed by dresses. And the red carpet walk into these various award shows are pre-sold to advertisers even before you get to the award show itself. In many cases, people tune in for the red carpet walk.
Oh, absolutely.
It's a rather bizarre phenomena for somebody like myself who has escorted various clients to these shows where we spend X amount of time discussing potential acceptance speeches and X amount of time discussing how one would deal with a loss of an award. And we spend an overwhelming amount of time talking about shoes.
Well, you're probably an authority on them by now.
Sadly, yes, John.
Well, Diana Ross, Paris Hilton. I mean, they're gems. They really are. So tell us of the other gems in the treasure chest of your escorting duties.
I can tell you that Miss Ross, who I believe is celebrating a birthday in a week or so,
good for her,
was one of the more fascinating people I ever represented, and liked her very much. I was a fan of her music and the Supremes, of course, long before I met her. And just a woman of impeccable taste, style, and somebody who really knew how she wanted to be represented and wouldn't settle for less. I admired, there were a lot of people who referred to her as a diva and, those kinds of things, terms ascribed to women that would not necessarily be ascribed to a male who had the same insistence about being presented in a certain way. She came up the long way and the hard way and achieved enormous popularity and entertained us gloriously. And the moments shared with her are absolutely memorable. And you referenced Paris, who I believe I represented for 5 years. It was a very, very intriguing experience for me, John. Some people said I may have been living my second childhood or going through a midlife crisis. The Paris Hilton that I knew, spent those years with, we're still friends and very close to the Hilton family. I think it's Kathy Hilton's birthday on Thursday. And I saw her last at her annual Christmas party that Rick and Kathy throw. It's a very close-knit, loving family. And, of course, what you see on screen, the portrayal, the stereotype, archetype of Paris playing Paris. Keep in mind, she was the mother of reality television.
That's true.
Whatever you think of the genre, she created it. There are some people who say maybe it began with Cops, possibly. However, in terms of a woman taking control of the reins, it was Paris and Nicole Richie. And, the character that she portrayed on the program was not the character who I would spend time with when we were sitting in the living room having discussions. She went through all the changes that we're completely aware of through media. What people might not be aware of is that right now she is elected to keep a lower media profile and sits on top of a empire worth in excess of $100 million, with more than 7 different fragrances of perfume branded around the world. There are Paris Hilton stores where you can buy the materials. And for a brief period of time in America, she was emblematic of the kind of being that teenage girls found enormously attractive and seductive. And she used her business acumen and her skills. She was never given any money by her parents. She created what she created on her own. And for those reasons and more, I have much respect and much affection for her. You see, John, with all the clients that I've represented, the one thing, the common denominator is, A, I have to like them. B, I have to believe that they believe. I don't represent hustlers. I don't represent people who just come to me and say, hey, look, we've got this thing. It's, cheap and it's junk and it doesn't really work, but we're just trying to find out the best way of getting people to buy it.
Right.
There are other people who do that. I don't represent politicians. I don't represent television evangelists. I think religious concepts should be given away for free. And as for the politicians, bless their heart, but I just don't buy into the game, So I have to like the people that I represent. I have to believe that they believe. I have to see some redeeming value in their work. It's not important that I like their music. It's important that I like them.
That's excellent.
I'm sorry.
No, I thought that's excellent. I naturally had to pop off when you were trying to finish the thought.
I know that there has been discussion, whatever discussion there is about Elliot Mintz, and it's not a subject that occupies everybody's mind or anybody's. However, I've heard those references. How could he possibly go from representing, Yoko Ono and Bob Dylan to somebody like Paris or whoever they demean? And, my response is always the same. Bring me another Bob Dylan.
Right.
And I'll put off retirement for another year.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's like the old song Tony Bennett performed recently. Once upon a time never comes again. So you just wait for those once upon a time moments. But
and when Tony Bennett leaves us, which I hope won't be for a long time, that will be the end of that genre of music that began a little bit earlier than Frank Sinatra and Dean Martin, and that will be the closing curtain on that. I lamented. A few weeks ago, we lost Pete Seeger.
Oh,
and
is that right?
He was the last link on the chain of a kind of contemporary American folk tradition for which nobody is left to carry that forward. You asked earlier about what's wrong with radio. Well, part of what's wrong with radio has to do with there are no new Pete Seegers and there are no new Tony Bennetts who could ever find a niche anywhere on the dial.
Yeah. Particularly now, even if one of them were to emerge, it would be a struggle. I doubt they'd be welcomed with open arms simply because they were different now.
So that would be the issue. If somebody walked through my door with the talent and the ability of, let's say, a Tony Bennett, and I happen to love his music and that style of music, and they said to me, I want you to represent me, and I want you to get me media attention, I want you to help me get on television programs and to sell records and to be heard, I would look at them with sadness in my eye and say, keep your checkbook in your back pocket.
Yeah.
I have you in my heart, but I can't deliver for you. Because it's not just those artists that have disappeared, but the audience who would patronize those artists no longer bundle up, get into the car, and drive to a concert hall.
Yeah.
So at the end of the day, as has been observed before in paraphrase, or Michael Jackson talking about the man in the mirror, with so many of these things that we discuss, the villain turns out to be the reflection that we gaze upon.
That's pretty strong stuff. It really is. It makes me ask the question do we even want to ponder where our civilization is going, given all the extras that life has given us, these amazing performers, whether in music or whether in being able to portray a character in such a believable sense that we really bought it all. We believed it. We embraced the message, and we let it we let it in. We let it take root. Sometimes in our hearts, some other times in our minds. But we allowed this to happen. We surrendered to the art. It's like, what art will we surrender to in future, as they like to say now, leaving out the word "the." I mean, I wonder what art we will surrender ourselves to in the future.
Well, I agree with your thesis. And if we ponder that for a moment, that, for those who accept our basic premise here, that in the end it was us, we blinked. Now, upon moments of quiet reflection, when we think of what was lost as a result of us not paying attention, it is so much easier to blame others for it, to absolve ourselves of our own indifference. So, I mean, it is one of the reasons for conspiracy theories that by taking it off of our shoulders and placing it on them or it or that group, we don't have to do anything. So
wow.
maybe the black helicopters in the sky, no matter who you ascribe the pilot as being, is an extension of one's own lament that we weren't on the front lines before the choppers were painted black and the windows were darkened. Where were we?
Where were we when the helicopters got painted black? Elliot, I got to tell you, you're amazing. I mean, what a conversationalist, and I've described other people I've spoken with as a rational man or an intelligent man, but it's like to have this depth of, it's like you have a philosophy that's permeated your work, and some people separate the two, as we know. It's so much easier to take the money and be miserable when you could have spent your life being happy, so that by the time the end of the line comes, the only thing that looks good really are maybe your books. I don't mean the ones you've written, I mean the ones that your accountant put together for you. My view of the world is that's not much of a life, but you
I can promise you that I'm far from brilliant, and think of myself more as ordinary than exceptional. I have met truly exceptional people. I do know the difference. But
Yeah.
you have been so hospitable and so kind that I do a lot of these, but not with somebody who listens, observes, pays attention, and contains the unspoken wisdom that you do. So this has been a joyous experience for me, and I thank you for having me. You can have me back anytime.
Absolutely, positively, and thank you so much for those kind words. You can't see me, but there was a little bow there. May you be blessed, sir, and we'll get the producer, the producer man, Mr. Producer Man, and we'll get into this Rhett Syndrome. We really will, and I mean, I'm kind of an all the way in or all the way out kind of guy, but I can't think of a more worthy cause to support, and I can't think of a more worthy enemy to confront than this. So let's do it.
Thank you for joining the battle.
Elliot Mintz, you heard the man. Consider deeply of his speeches, and also consider the Rhett program. We'll be covering that in the future, and we'll be speaking with Elliot to see if we can, through him, reach some specialists who can bring a more complete understanding as to what's going to be required for us to conquer this. We can't conquer every ailment in the world, but I, for one, am all for conquering anything that attacks little girls and turns them from little girls into little girls that are struggling with absolutely every aspect of their existence in this physical world. Thank you very much for being with us. May God bless you, whether you believe in him or not. Exercise caution.